is Jessica May, and I'm the Director of the Research and Innovation section within Biosecurity Strategy and Reform Division here at DAF. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land many of us are meeting on today, and recognise any other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT and region. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and region. I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all other lands on which our attendees are gathered today, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today's webinar. So we have a lot of attendees on the line, so a lot of you are joining from many different places around, so please feel free to pop it in the chat where you're joining us from. Before we begin, can everyone ensure that your microphones are on mute and your cameras are off unless you are part of the presentation? Today's session will be recorded and made available on CEBRA's YouTube channel. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation by either using the hand up gesture or posting a question in the chat. If you post it in the chat on the side, I'll come back to it at the end. So for any newcomers today, the Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis is a long-standing biosecurity research initiative hosted by the University of Melbourne. CEBRA provides the Australian and New Zealand governments with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform biosecurity risk management activities. Today, we will hear from Professor Mark Burgman, an ecologist and leading research scientist whose work has helped shape modern conservation biology, ecological modelling and environmental risk analysis in Australia and internationally. So we're very lucky to have Mark today. Mark was the founding director of the Australian Centre of Excellence for Risk Analysis, which became CEBRA in 2013, and has held senior roles at the Imperial College of London and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. A fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, Mark has published extensively and is widely recognised for advancing evidence-based environmental management, particularly in situations where uncertainty is high. Today's CEBRAnar will explore how artificial intelligence can be used to link red list threat assessments to specific business activities, supporting more informed and nature-positive investment decisions. While red list assessments estimate extinction risks, they do not always clearly identify how particular activities contribute to those risks. Today, Professor Burgman will outline how AI-generated argument maps and expert judgment can help bridge this gap and how this approach could be adapted to biosecurity. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Mark, and I will hand over to you now to get started.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, we can also see your recording. So if you probably make your presentation full screen,
I will certainly do that.
Okay.
Away. Oops. I'll get there eventually. There we go. Hooray. All right.
Perfect.
So thanks very much for this opportunity. I have a couple of people in the room here with me, so they may butt in and throw comments at me as we go along. This is about using AI, and this work is quite new. It's also a collaboration. Rashid Akchakaya, Paul Bernstein, Attila Blau, Amanda Irwin and Hannah Lehman, and they're in these various institutions. This work began because Hannah Lehman, who works in the stock exchange, contacted me when I was in London, and she said to me, this is what's happening in my space. This diagram shows you the proportion of companies, firms that are reporting on biodiversity between the yellow is in 2020 and the blue is 2022. So companies across sectors are starting to report on their impacts on biodiversity. And she said the demand from the company sector for biodiversity reporting and for biodiversity impact reports in annual reports and so on is becoming much more commonplace, to the extent that the business community, the money is ready, was the way she said it, and she didn't think that the biodiversity indices were. Now, we can look at biodiversity indices from a number of perspectives. We can think about species, ecosystems, or ecosystem services, perhaps. They're the three simplest lenses to look at this through. And of course, these kinds of foci are identical to those that you will see in biosecurity. And we've known for a long time that the assessments that we do for threatened species and threatened ecosystems are identical in structure and in the way in which reasoning is constructed to import risk assessments or to a potentially invasive species risk assessment. So, but from the point of view of investment, we need not to consider the particular impacts of a single company, but how an investor can assess all companies in a portfolio in a comparable way. So we need to look at all companies in all places at all times. If we're on the New York Stock Exchange or the London Stock Exchange, there are a lot of companies that I might invest in. How do I decide? And does it matter? And of course, to make a decision of that kind, you need to know, and this will and could have implications for the way in which we think about investments in biosecurity. But that I'll come back to that a bit later on. We need coverage of the investment universe. That is, all the companies need to be assessed. It needs to be transparent and robust. That is, we need to trust the way in which the assessments are done. We need to know the properties of the data and how the various methodologies aggregate information to lead us to make a decision. One of the problems that we face is, of course, that the volume of publications and the number of organizations involved in this space is so large that it's becoming indigestible. There's a difference in the speed at which financial institutions, Hannah said, can publish literature versus academic institutions, and a limit on the volume of literature that decision makers can consume. It's overwhelming. These are copies of reports in the last couple of years, and there's more since these been put out. So what do we need? So we're going to today just talk about species. We're not going to talk about ecosystems or ecosystem services, but the same reasoning and logic applies to those things. What's needed to measure the extinction burden of an investment portfolio? If you invest your money in the stock market and the companies are doing work, what is the contribution of those companies to the extinction of species globally? We need a sum over all companies in a portfolio of the extinction risk burden times the budget that you invest in that company divided by its market cap, they call it, I've discovered, which is how much the company do you own. And the challenge to a company is to minimize extinction burden or maximizing productivity, market share and profit, and for the investor to minimize portfolio extinction risk burden while maximizing returns and minimizing investment risk. So these are this is the language of and the perspective of people who want to spend their money in a market for the sake of the investment. So what's needed to attribute extinction burden to a firm, a company, an activity, or a country? Now, the way in which we think about impacts on species is we have threats. These threats typically are human activities in the context of investment. These threats lead to stresses, interactions or resources of the species that are impaired by the threats that lead to symptoms, which are the red list parameters that indicate increased extinction risk. That means the population is declining, it's becoming more fragmented, it has a very small size. And then that leads us to an assessment of the risk. And the risk is, in the context of biosecurity, the risk is very high, medium, low. And in the language of the IUCN, the risk is critical, endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, and so on. So the way in which we think about the attribution of harm to a human activity is through a pathway like this. So what's right and what's wrong with the event list assessments? They provide a direct measure of species extinctions and recovery. They can be used with economic input-output analyses to assess supply chain impacts. They can be disaggregated to national, subnational levels, and they identify threats that can be linked to company or sector activities. However, if you've ever worked with the red list for species and the red list for ecosystems, you know that the lengths of the lists of threats reflect the knowledge of and the interest in a species or an ecosystem service. We know that threat assessments confound threats, stresses, and symptoms. People mix those things up, and we'll see some examples. The scope and severity of threats are mostly absent in the red lists. Evidence is often absent, and the reasoning linking threats to stresses and symptoms is often inconsistent or incomplete. And here is a link with biosecurity, because an import risk assessment includes evidence. It includes text that represents the reasoning that links the human activities, the pathways to the probability of entry, establishment, and spread, which is which is structurally the same as estimating the impact of human activities on the potential for the loss of a species. And the import risk assessments, there are fewer of them because we have 166,000 red list assessed species, and there's another 1.6 million to go. And we don't normally contemplate 1.6 million import risk assessments, so there are fewer of them. But the issues about linking the evidence to threats, to stresses, to symptoms, to a judgment about the risk is part and parcel of evaluating the completeness, the consistency, and the evidence support for a pest risk assessment, for example. Other things that occur with the red list assessments, links to firm activities are absent. We don't specify what firms are affecting what species. There is a taxonomic bias towards vertebrates. There's a geographic bias away from the global south. There's loads more species to do. Many of the assessments are out of date. Measures may undervalue particular species that we should care about more, and measures may encourage the move of operations to the global south where there may be fewer perceived impacts on species. And that's a perverse incentive that we want to avoid. So we have some problems. I'm going to show you some examples of some of these issues. This is a plant that grows in Western Australia, Banksia goodii. Here is what would pass for a risk assessment. And in this, there's a list of, there's some text that represents the threats. And then there's a table that has a pre-specified classification of threat types: roads and railways, invasive, non-native or alien species, diseases, habitat shifting and alteration, and the timing. It's ongoing, it's in the future, and the stresses, the ecosystem stresses, or the stresses directly on the species. And then there's an assessment of the scope and severity of those threats. Do they occur across the majority of the species habitat, over a proportion, or a smaller proportion over most of it? Is the severity leading to rapid declines, to slow declines, and so on? But if you look up at the threats, the main identified threats to these species are inappropriate fire regimes, poor dispersal ability, low reproductive rates. They shouldn't be considered to be threats. They're not threats, they are an attribute of the species itself. And so this is just to point out that we can be undisciplined in thinking about what a threat is, or how it communicates through stresses and symptoms to an impact on the species. Another example, this is a gorgeous thing called the maned three-toed sloth. Now it occurs on the coasts of Brazil. Now here is the threat assessment, and I have seen this in import risk assessments in a similar vein, and that is, this says the expansion of agricultural areas, pastoral urban sprawl are the main threats to the species, and there's a citation. Then the rate of deforestation in the Atlantic forest of eastern Brazil has decreased dramatically in the last 3 decades, but has not stopped. Therefore, the pressure on the habitat continues. This is particularly true, and then it goes on to say a bunch of things about particular regions, about urban sprawl, coal production, the states that have this and don't have this, and what's happened in the last 30 years, without citations. There's no, which says that if I want to verify these claims, I have to go look for myself. Likewise, the isolation of small populations can lead to a drastic reduction in gene flow in areas with little habitat available to the species. Its displacement may include the use of open areas such as pastures and so on. So there are elements in here that represent threats to the species, again, without any specific evidence to support those claims. And then we go back to the third paragraph, and people start to introduce evidence of different kinds, which includes PM, Santos, personal communication. That's a perfectly valid expression of a source of evidence. The preceding paragraph has none, and I have to guess about how reliable it is, whether it has support at all, how I go about chasing this down, when these claims were made. I can presume they were later than 2019, but I don't know, or 2022, but I don't know, so on. So as a consequence, there are 3 specified threats in this threat table. We have, on the far left-hand side, we have residential and commercial development, agriculture and aquaculture, transportation and service corridors, and biological resource use being the threats to this species. But there are three things that don't appear in the pros that have preceded this. So the idea that crops are threatening the species, wood and pulp, plantations and small growers and agroforestry simply aren't mentioned in the preceding dialogue. So not only there are claims without support, there are indications of threats without support and without any preamble. And this doesn't mean that these claims are wrong by any means, but it means that when we have written our red list assessments, we've been undisciplined in the way in which we've gone about it. There has been no motivation for this discipline in the past. There's been no real imperative for us to provide the level of detail that we could have provided. And I presume that the people who wrote this impact risk assessment had some reason for thinking that cropping, wood and pulp plantations and smallholder agro industries were contributing to harm to the species habitat or directly to the species itself, but they simply didn't tell us what those things were. Here's another example. This gorgeously named tree. I won't attempt to say it. This You'll note that the date this was assessed, January 1998, and it says rather glibly in the annotations, needs updating. So it's 30 years old. We presume that the assessment that took place at that time is sufficiently current. You see its distributions, Angola, Cameroon, Congo, so Central West Africa. If we go to the assessment itself, despite the fact that it is way out of date, there is no reasoning. It just says biological resource logging, wood harvesting, the motivation is unknown, it causes ecosystem degradation, and I don't know the scope and I don't know the severity. Nevertheless, I think this thing is endangered. Now, this tells me if I want to interrogate the claims in this, I have to do my own homework. I presume the people who wrote this had a reason for thinking this, and the reasoning could have been related to me in some text. But these people who do these assessments they do it for free. They do it in their own time. They sit in a group and they might do 20 or 30 species in a day, and they're trying to compile evidence from GBIF or various other data sources. They're generating maps. They're looking at map trajectories of the distributions of species over time. They're thinking about the various threats that are affecting this species, and they're drawing a conclusion, and they're doing it at breakneck speed. And it's a challenge and it's exhausting, and we can't expect them to do much more. It's already a Herculean task to have done what they've achieved so far. And so we looked at this problem, the problem that you're looking at now, the absence of reading, the absence of evidence, the lack of discipline in communicating. And we budgeted, for example, if we were to redo 160,000 species and bring them all up to date, it would take us probably 5 to 10 years and cost us $50 million. So it's just unachievable for the kinds of resources we have available, given the distribution of the people who participate. It's just too big a task. And yet it's going to matter. Now, this is Acacia acuminata, another species that grows in Western Australia, possibly threatened by mining outside protected areas, it says, and by frequent fires, which potentially depletes the seed bank. That's the only information that was related in the form of prose. So it says mining and quarrying and fire suppression may be affecting the future of this species. But I want to point out one more thing here, and I'm introducing a different kind of diagram. This is called an argument map, and some people amongst my friends in department in Canberra and other places have seen argument maps before, and some of you may even love them, but they're not much used. I know some of our colleagues in New Zealand have deployed some of these tools in the past. This is an argument map that says mining and quarrying threaten this species because part of the species range occurs outside protected areas, and mining in the species range would cause a loss of habitat, and mining may occur outside protected areas within the species habitat. Now, there's an implicit claim mining in the species range would cause loss of habitat. It's kind of obvious, but it wasn't stated. And if the argument were to be complete, you'd bother to write it down, because not everybody would know this. And there are other circumstances and other species where the implied premise is not obvious to everybody. You need to be a biologist or a specialist biologist to know what that missing piece of logic is. And the second part of this argument map says that fire and fire suppression threaten the species because frequent fires may deplete the seed bank, and fires may become more frequent, more intense. It doesn't say, and a depleted seed bank will lead to a population decline. So those co-premises, if you like, were obvious to the person who wrote this, but if you're going to communicate this to other people, then we need to be a little bit more disciplined. And finally, I think that the people who wrote this, back when they wrote it, may have overlooked the fact that there is potential for a disease, namely Phytophthora, to be introduced to this population. And I only know that because I worked on similar species in this place in the past. So I know that Phytophthora is an issue, and it could be introduced to this population. And if it is, that could harm it could kill individuals in this population. So, errors of reasoning. There are books written about this, and it's not easy because errors of reasoning are context dependent. What may be wrong in one context may not be wrong in another, but some of the things that arise in red list assessments that we could call errors of reasoning are the misalignment of evidence with a claim, the lack of evidence, that is unsupported claims, arguments from authority, arguments that say, you should believe me because I'm important, irrelevant or unreliable evidence, overlooked causal pathways, such as I've overlooked a disease, inconsistent arguments, arguments that tend to conflict with one another, overlooked objections, motivational biases. Now, there are others. I'm going to show you, we made a list of the errors of reasoning that we've detected in red list assessments so that we can examine red list assessments and see which kinds of errors of reasoning are most prevalent and which ones can be corrected most easily. Incomplete or unspecified threats. I've simply omitted a premise, a claim of some kind that was implicit, or my threats are not linked to stresses or symptoms. An example is that vegetation is being cleared, and I forgot to say that vegetation is taking place, clearing is taking place within the species habitat. Maybe implicit, but may not be. Ambiguous or context-dependent evidence, as an example, is when we just saw fire as a threat, but I didn't say whether it was any fire, too frequent a fire, too infrequent a fire, too intense a fire. What did I mean? I knew when I wrote this down, but I just didn't bother to tell you. Unsupported threats, that is, there's no evidence in the narratives or the bibliography. Sometimes things are double counted, farming, which causes fire and fires, and contradictory evidence, which is this is a real example. Not logging threatens the species, even though the species is restricted to montane forests, and logging occurs in lowland forests. Now, there may have been other reasoning that wasn't provided, so it could be that it was incomplete, but at least appears to be contradictory. Incomplete documentation of classification, unlisted threats, rabid threats, threats that appear in the threat list without being mentioned in the narratives, unclassified threats, threats that are mentioned in the narratives but don't appear in the threat classification scheme, like arson, vandalism, or politics can cause harm. Unlisted threats is threats appear in a paragraph under headings such as geographic range or taxonomy. That's just because we've been undisciplined in presenting our information within the red list assessments themselves. And there are, of course, the kinds of things that you see in most publications, mistakes with citations and references. That is, mistakes with the evidence that you're presenting to support your claims. So these are not trivial necessarily. And indeed, this one example where there was different dates listed, there were two publications, and the publications said different things, and we're not absolutely sure which one they intended to cite. So we have to, at some point, make a decision about how reliable the evidence is for each of these claims. And what I've done here is present the same, I've presented this document, this tree, if you like, as a table. And some people prefer tables. It's the same thing. Mining and quarrying threaten this species because part of the species range occurs outside protected areas, and mining may occur outside the protected area in the species habitat, and mining in the species habitat will cause loss of habitat. So on. Now, I can then document, well, the problem here is the premises were missing. That's why they're the ones that are in red. And for several of these premises, there was no supporting evidence or no credible evidence, even for those that were mentioned. There is a classification of the reliability of evidence, or the weight of evidence, if you like, that is here. And we use this routinely to assess qualitatively how well the evidence supports a claim, in short. And we rely on two dimensions: its credibility and its relevance. If it comes from a highly credible source and it's well designed and there's large sample sizes, but it's for an entirely different species or genus, we think, well, it still has low credibility for the question I'm asking, and so on. This is, of course, subjective. There is no known quantitative way of doing this in a repeatable fashion, but this is a work in progress. Now, argument maps, we posited their use because they would require an assessor, a pest risk assessment person or a threat assessment person, to be disciplined about their reasoning, so that arguments are complete, self-consistent, and the evidence is complete. Now, they're not trivial outcomes. And our first thought when we first proposed these to biosecurity folk and to the threatened species folk was, well, this is the way to do things because it's just better than making it up and being prey to those kinds of errors of reasoning that you can trip over without meaning to. So why not do this? And people hate doing it. We also tried this with the US Department of Homeland Security. A bunch of years back, we were involved in a project with them, and we suggested to them to improve the quality of reasoning for strategic risk assessments and for terrorist risk assessments of various kinds, that the risk analysts in the various departments of defense and the intelligence departments in the United States start to use these tools, and most of their risk assessors hated using them. They wouldn't use them. They just thought that drove them mad. And we don't know why, because I love them. But and a small proportion of risk analysts did like them, but they just refused to use them. So that didn't go well. There are some very simple rules for good argument maps. Here they are. I won't read them out or expect you to remember them. But if you deploy these rules, if you ensure each simple claim has at least two co-reasons, if you presume all significant terms in the claim also appear in at least one of the reasons, and if you presume if a term appears in a reason but not in a claim, it appears in another reason, that's all you have to do. And you think, wow, that's pretty straightforward. It's very rational. It's very structured. Why don't I just do this? It does take thinking, and you do have to concentrate. It's not as easy as it looks if you just look at this simple list. So here's an example of that I showed you before for Banksia goodii, and the main threats were appropriate fire regimes, and then it says these things that are not threats, and it goes back to specifying some threats. Here is an argument map for land clearance as a threat for Banksia goodii, because past land clearance has cleared most habitat, and there's a reference, and because most remaining populations are on road verges, and there's some evidence, and so on. And one of the other lovely things about an argument map is that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the map as it's drawn as a diagram or as a table, as I showed you earlier, and the prose. The evidence suggests that land clearance is a threat to Banksia goodii. There are two main reasons for this. You'll note there are two branches under that top box. The first reason is that past land clearance is cleared, and so on. You speak the structure of the argument map, and you get complete, self-consistent, well-reasoned prose. That is a good reason for making a judgment about the risk posed to a species or by a species. All right. Now, that's where we sort of got stuck. Now, we were thinking about the problem of using the red list assessments to guide investments. And we looked at this and we thought, this is impossibly large. We looked at this about 2 years ago, and we thought you have to have, because species are distributed spatially and company activities are distributed spatially, you have to intersect the activities with species distributions. And then you have to know what company is doing what where to be able to assess what harm they may be having on each of these species. And then you have to link the company's activities to the threats that the species is facing. It's a massive, massive problem because there are thousands of companies, thousands of sectors, trade between all countries. And lo and behold, Amanda Irwin, she's a physicist from the University of Sydney who went back to do a PhD and thought, I'll do this. She solved this problem with a massive input-output table. And so we took her architecture, and we got her help, of course, and we got the Dow Jones Index, and we linked company activities from the Dow Jones, there are only 30 companies, to we have a record of where they're trading, what they're buying, what they're selling, and which countries that's happening in. We know what threats there are for the species in those countries. We link those company activities to those threats, and then we can apply an extinction burden or an extinction culpability to each of these companies. And we can say, well, if you invest in these 30 companies in the Dow Jones, this is how many species extinctions you should expect to precipitate over the next period. Now, we didn't, and then we thought, well, we'll do a sort of, that tells us something, but well, what we'd like to know is whether something like the MSCI ratings for the sustainability of these companies is actually a useful guide to where you should invest if you want to invest in nature positive outcomes. So we deleted all the triple Bs and we recomputed the extinction burden, and then we just kept the triple A's and the double A's, and we repeated it. So we had a green index and then another green index, two green indices that were based upon the MSCI rankings, and we calculated the extinction burden based upon the red list data and the input-output analysis that we did on a global basis. And to our surprise, there's a signal. Just look at the bottom row. The numbers are kind of irrelevant, just the relative scale that matters. The larger the number, the less the impact. And if you look at the standard, the base case on the bottom row, it says that if you invest in green 1 or green 2, your impact in terms of expected number of species extinctions by the companies in which you've invested is less. We got a signal. We didn't expect one because there's so much noise in the red list data. There's a lot of, for example, if you're BHP Billiton and you're buying copper because you want to make copper pipes and you're buying it from New Caledonia, we look at the copper mining in New Caledonia. We attribute a proportion of that trade to BHP Billiton, and we also intersect the copper mining in New Caledonia with species in New Caledonia that are threatened by copper mining, and that tells us what your proportional impact on those species is, and we have to accumulate that over all species. And we're expecting there's a lot of noise in this system, and we've got a signal. So this tells us that the red list data matter. As imperfect as they are, they matter. And if you want to encourage people to invest in nature positive outcomes, there is a potential pathway in this. So how to get this done? We don't have the time or the energy or the resources to make argument maps for 166,000 species. We've done a few by hand this year. I've got up to a total of 38. We've got 166,000 minus 38 to go. It's going to take us a long time. Oh, I have some friends who do AI stuff, and they work for a company. They are a company called Paper Wizard. They're based in Queensland. Now they wrote software that does literature reviews of scientific proposals or papers that are ready for publication. It's essentially a colleague who will do a literature review of your work before you submit it. So you can get feedback on all kinds of things, and it's particularly good at analysing the methods that you might use in almost any discipline in science. It's terrifyingly good. So I thought that it's such an impressive platform that I got in contact and I said, well, can you guys create argument maps? And they said, what's an argument map? And I explained. I sent them the little 4 dot points, and they said, yeah, we think we can do this. And 2 weeks later, they came back and said, if you give me a species name, we will generate a risk assessment, an argument map, an argument table. And it'll be a fully expressed argument map. It'll have the premises, the co-premises, the data, the citations, everything. So I sent it this one. I sent them this one, the species threatened by habitat loss, degradation due to agricultural development, exacerbated by natural disasters such as hurricanes. And I've left out a little bit of the text, but there were about a dozen citations in there. And you can see that it's found a bunch of threats. And this is what they sent. This is the threat assessment that they sent back. If you look at that, they say terrestrial farming, animal farming and ranching and herding threaten this species because dairy farming, construction of only known locality of the species directly caused habitat loss by physically removing portions of the streamside grassland microhabitat. Much more detail than we typically find in a red list assessment. And then adjacent, there's the evidence. It tells you what the evidence is, the citation, and in brief, why this citation is relevant to this particular claim. And it gives you its assessment of the strength of that evidence. This is a work in progress. I only got this back 2 weeks ago, and I'm looking at this thinking, wow, this is like a really, really good risk assessor has done the job. And then take a look that, if you recall, there were this many rows in the human version, and this has 54 rows of reasons. So it has thought about things more deeply, it has parsed the arguments more carefully, and it has found evidence for almost all of these claims, most of which were missing from the human version. And then look at the citations. Now, our friend who did this originally found a dozen citations. Here they are. This is the citation list from our friends in AI. It finishes at citation number 46. Now, we sent this back to our friend and said, are these citations relevant? And he said, yes, they are. Now, it's easy for us to say, well, why didn't they do a better job? But because what I explained, the people who do this care about these species. They really care about them, but they do not have infinite time and resources, and they're doing. It may be that our assessment of the threats faced by this species just depend upon this core set of references, and it may be the assessment doesn't change as a consequence of this much more detailed threat assessment. But certainly for cases like this one, whoops, where there was nothing, we can do better. We know we can do better using these tools. And the other thing is that he did it in an hour, or actually about 26 minutes. It didn't take days to do this assessment. So it got me thinking, of course, because I spend a bit of my time doing import risk assessments, that this has direct tangible relevance to biosecurity. If we're doing a pest risk assessment or an import risk assessment, and we need to be comprehensive in our assessments, and we need to provide credible evidence for the various claims, and if these claims matter, if a particular step in this reasoning pathway makes a difference in a decision, then you want that parsed as clearly as possible. And if you're time stressed, and I know the people in government who do this are perennially short of time and resources to get this job done as completely as they would like, this offers a pathway to get that done. And one of the advantages for biosecurity is there are far fewer to be done. You're not trying to do 160,000 of these. Now, it hasn't been developed for biosecurity. It would need to be tuned for biosecurity. One of the nice things about this particular system, and I have to say I don't have any commercial interest in this whatsoever, is that it's closed, so that if you submit a biosecurity risk analysis, it's not going to be therefore mined and put on the web. It's a closed system. So because these people were developing this for academics, and they understood the need for confidentiality in submitted publications, and so the system doesn't learn from the stuff that you give it. And so the evaluation from our friends about the AI-generated decision, the argument map or the argument table was it admitted residential and commercial development as a threat for this species, although this is listed as one of the 3 threat categories in the red list assessment itself. However, it did identify potential additional threats for an invasive species. Now, this is brand new. We don't know why it seemed to have overlooked residential and commercial development, but it'll be interesting to see why. The specialist said, I do not believe the table missed any causal connections. While I'm sure the additional references could be included, I'm not sure why there would be. That is, are there any more beyond the 54? He said, I don't think there are. And the references that were identified are sufficient for the threats. And the most notable error in reasoning, that is, that the machine made would be the amount of inference in the impact of a given threat based solely on the fact the species is very range restricted. Again, it's not actually an error of reasoning. It's a different weighting that this person might give. And so it tells us that if we were to deploy this for threatened species or for pest risk assessments, a human needs to look at this and give it a common sense check. That is, does this make sense? Has it overlooked something that immediately obvious, something that I would have put in there? Has it weighted things as I would have weighted them? Has it come on too strong in one area and not in another? But to me, the message is clear that if you can ask a group of AI specialists with 2 weeks' notice, if I give you a species name, can you generate a comprehensive threat assessment? And they deliver it in spades, it tells me that this is the place where we need to be looking for all of our future work in this area. And that's all I have. Everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. Does anybody have any questions? If you put your hand up, I can throw to you, or if you pop them in the chat, we can go from there. Ariel.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Thanks for that. I just had a question about what you told the AI
Ariel,
people.
hi, Ariel. Sorry, just say hi, Ariel. I do know who you are.
Yeah.
How are you? Why are you on this? Why are you on this call?
The argument mapping stuff.
But where are you working now? Let me rephrase.
The Hunt Lab, which a lot of our work comes from actually teaching argument mapping to the IC, as you'll know.
All right, sorry, everybody. Yeah. So what's the question?
When you were giving the instructions to the AI guys, did you tell them about the rabbit rule and the holding hands rule to identify the assumptions, or?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And did you find that it was following that process to identify them?
Yes. I haven't validated that as much as I like, because literally this came in last week and I haven't looked at it carefully. But okay. Yes, as far as I can tell just from scanning, yes, that's been the case.
Cool. The other question I had was that when you evaluated the argument map, your last point there was something about the amount of inferences that are required. And that's kind of consistent with what I've found using AI to try and build argument maps. It really struggles with that problem of abstraction. So going from the evidence layer by layer to the actual point you're trying to prove. And it's interesting to see that those were also what you found with your argument maps. And it seems like we haven't quite gotten there with the AI yet.
Well, yeah, and I think as a concluding clause, I would probably not agree with you, because humans leave stuff out all the time, as we see, either purposefully or without meaning to. And so I think we've got to hold AI to the same standard as we do our particularly good expert analysts, and it does considerably better than them. So I think it has arrived. It could be better, and it needs better training. And I think, but given that this is 2 weeks old, I do think that we can fix those things. I mean, we just need to examine why it seems to have overlooked particular things, and we might find that its reasoning is still good. I don't know. We need to look. We need to look. But it's a fair point.
Cool, thanks.
Fantastic. Next we have Rick.
Yeah, hi, Mark. Good to see you again.
Where are you? Oh, hi.
Yeah, that was super interesting and great that you could share something so hot off the press. But in relation to import risk assessments, I don't know what the percentage of content in a risk assessment is in terms of expert opinion versus citable sources, but it's pretty high. How do you think that could get managed or capitalised with AI?
Yeah, look, I think part of it is that, and I've had this discussion with colleagues in the department in previous years. Part of it is that there is going to be common knowledge. There are certain things that people know, and you think, well, I don't need to cite that because everybody knows it. And I'd just be driving myself nuts just putting a citation against all of these things. And so there's kind of an accumulation of belief, but that bleeds into things we kind of know, and then that bleeds into things we hope are true. And then that leads to things I'm just making up. And the boundaries between those things are very, very diffuse. And some people are very good at staying at one end of that spectrum, and some people leap to the other end and pretend as though it's true and don't actually know and aren't aware of it themselves. So I think what this would do would be to provide the necessary discipline. You don't have to drive yourself nuts by putting in references for everything, because this machine will do it for you. It'll say, look, this is the evidence for this, and you might get some surprises in doing so. You might think, oh, I thought we knew that. Maybe that's not true. And I have seen in import risk assessments some of the errors of reasoning that appear in that list. For example, I've seen misspecified evidence that was claimed to be for one thing that was evidence for another thing, evidence that was actually contrary to the claim that appeared in the import risk assessment. But superficially, unless you read it really carefully, you wouldn't pick it up. And I think we're all capable of those kinds of errors, and I think the machine will help us improve the quality of our import risk assessments or pest risk assessments quite substantially. This is a very rational because I've never seen it applied, so we'll see.
Great. Andrew, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, super. Thanks, Mark. Great presentation. The argument mapping idea has been attractive for a long time. And one of the things that I speculate is that the modularity of the argument structure allows for the possibility of node reuse across multiple domains.
Absolutely.
I'm curious if you have any evidence of that and the efficiencies that it entails.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. And it will tend to drive assessors mad because you'll see the same thread appear in different places because it's relevant in different places. Typically what we would do, we would state it once and then it's implicit subsequently. And the machine is going to be your worst nightmare in terms of OCD. It's going to spell them all out, and every time. I think there'll be resistance to that. And I think what will happen is that over time, hopefully, people get used to seeing the necessity of being diligent about distributing that evidence wherever it's relevant, or that thread of argument wherever it's relevant, just to make the arguments complete. Now we could, and you and I talked about this yesterday a little bit, we could then take this complete map and distill it into something simpler, delete various branches that aren't necessary. If we want to communicate to a wider audience, so we don't want to drive them mad, we could then we could back engineer a simpler argument that would communicate better. But that's also, you know, as you saw yesterday, brand new work in progress. We don't know how to do it. We don't know what we're doing. We're making it up as we go along. Yeah, I think that's you made that point yesterday, and it's going to be something that will be a challenge to deal with.
Great. Sam, did you want to ask yours?
Hey, Mark, great to see you again. Thanks for getting me thinking. I've been thinking about use of tools.
Oh, yeah. All these people I know and love. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Feels mutual. Hey, been thinking about the risks of government regulatory scientists using AI tools like this for some time. And in terms of using a tool like Paper Wizard, I think there are risks around the coverage of the literature that it's been built on, risks around hallucinations, and probably also some legal risks, particularly around defensible decision-making for a regulator. But are there others that you can think of that I've missed?
No, look, the people who are writing this are very aware of things like hallucinations. I mean, that's what they spend every day thinking about that stuff and try how to anticipate, how to mitigate those kinds of risks. They the legal risks are beyond my pay level. I hear about them and I don't fully understand them, and I imagine it's a nightmare. They have done their best. This group. And I'm sure there are other groups that have done their best to ensure that the material that's submitted remains confidential. And if what you're after is an examination of the methods, the technology, the analysis, the statistical analysis, the physical interventions, the pragmatics and the operational constraints that have been applied, you would want to take a look at this, even if it's no more than to prompt you to think about stuff that you might not otherwise have thought about. One of the things that we did early on being 3 or 4 months ago, was that we sent us some of our own published papers that were of this kind. And the feedback we got was it found all the flaws we knew about and then some. And we're thinking, oh, okay, I should have perhaps put a couple of sentences in there about that. And if nothing else, if I was doing an import risk assessment for you tomorrow, I would run it through this just to make sure I hadn't missed anything really obvious and hadn't done anything really dumb. I would be much more confident about what I sent you as a consequence.
Interesting. So the risks in not using it too. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Much larger. Yep.
Okay, we've got another question from Amber.
Thanks, Mark. Fascinating talk. I actually work in Sam Hamilton's group, and we work in sort of the Pacific biosecurity space. And I'm just interested, it's a fascinating area, and this is really interesting work that you're talking about, real bleeding edge stuff. I'm really interested in what you said earlier about the need for a common sense check on the outputs. And I'm just wondering whether you have any plans, or whether you've done it already, to look at ground truthing, particularly when your data is gappy. So when we work in the Pacific, we're working in areas where we might have quite a bit of data, for example, on animal diseases in one suite of islands, or in one, maybe just the main island in an archipelago, but we'll be missing data from the other 1,000 islands, or we won't have comparable data from the whole region. So it would be really interesting to know how this performs when you have a system where your data isn't good, the input data has holes in it, and compare the performance of this system against a data set where you've got reasonable coverage. And I'm just wondering whether you've thought about that, or whether you've got any plans to test that, and how you might go about that.
Yeah, look, that's probably stage 3 or 4 of a project that hasn't even started yet. It's a great question. But my intuition would be, given that its power to be as comprehensive as it can be, looking across languages, looking across grey literature and publications of various kinds and books and all that stuff, and get its head around such a large amount of literature so quickly, if there's something to be found, it'll find it much more. I mean, can't guarantee, but it's much more likely to find it than you or I are to find something obscure. We know that already from just looking at the 38 species that we've examined so far. Whether it's going to be qualitatively better in terms of data scarce or data poor environments, in terms of making a judgment or providing a recommendation or providing reasoning that leads to a particular conclusion, it's hard to know. That's a great question. And maybe the AI stuff will hinge too much on what is already established and in novel environments, just like invasive species everywhere. You don't really know what's going to happen. So yeah, I don't know. I guess bottom line is it's a great question, and we might know the answer in a couple of years.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark. We might reach out to you afterwards for a bit more of a chat about this. It's fascinating.
I'd love to chat. I'm based in Hawaii, by the way, and we've got a biosecurity symposium happening from June 15 to June 18, and I've got a bunch of people coming to that, but it's about the Pacific Islands and things. And it's in Hawaii. So, Sam, can she go?
Oh, you know what DAF's budget's like, Mark, but please shoot through the program. That'd be really interesting. And sorry to hijack the call from everyone else.
Oh, good. So we might wrap up, but thank you, Mark, for sharing such valuable insights today. So the recording will be available on CEBRA's YouTube channel shortly, and our next CEBRAnar will be in June. It's a very special CEBRAnar in June. It marks the 20th anniversary of CEBRA. So it will be held on 25th of June at 11 a.m. So please mark your calendars. It'll be introduced by Professor Andrew Robertson, and this special edition will highlight the impact of CEBRA over the past 2 decades. You'll hear from a range of CEBRA experts on how biosecurity has changed over time, insights on the most critical issues facing biosecurity today, and what biosecurity might look like in the future. So details on how to register through Humantix will be out shortly, so keep an eye out. Also, a quick reminder that the Australian Biosecurity Awards are back again for 2026, with nominations now open. The awards celebrate excellence, innovation and leadership across Australia's biosecurity system and recognise the people and teams protecting Australia's environment, agriculture and communities, from the ground action to research, policy and partnerships. So if you know an individual, group or organisation making a real impact in protecting Australia from biosecurity threats, please consider nominating them before Tuesday the 16th of June. The team will share a link in the chat, but otherwise thank you everyone today for your engagement and for being here. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's been a huge pleasure. Lovely to see all those faces again. Bye now.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone.